Disassemble bolts and nuts. Disassemble the coupling hub. Disassemble coupling nuts. Disassemble the bearing cover after unscrewing bolts. Disassemble the upper bearing casing after unscrewing bolts. Disassemble the bearing nut. Disassemble the ball bearing after taking off the ball cover. Disassemble the upper sleeve bearing. Turn and disassemble the lower sleeve bearing. Disassemble the lower bearing casing after unscrewing nuts and studs. Disassemble the deflector. Disassemble the bearing bracket after taking off bolts. Unscrew the sleeve nut after disassembling the set screw. Disassemble the set plate after unscrewing bolts. Disassemble the flange after unscrewing nuts and studs. Disassemble the float seat O-ring and seal ring after unscrewing bush. Disassemble the drive collar, springs, and SP retainer one by one in order after unscrewing drive pins. Disassemble the sleeve and O-ring. Disassemble the throw bushing and the grand cover after unscrewing nuts and bolts. Disassemble the upper bearing casing after unscrewing bolts. Disassemble the upper sleeve bearing. Turn and disassemble the lower sleeve bearing. Disassemble the deflector. Disassemble the lower bearing casing after unscrewing nuts and studs. Disassemble the deflector. Disassemble the bearing bracket after unscrewing bolts. Disassemble the mechanical seal as the previous steps. Take out the shaft and impeller from the booster pump casing. Disassemble the impeller. Disassemble bolts and nuts. Disassemble the coupling hub. Disassemble coupling nuts. Disassemble the upper and lower side cover after unscrewing bolts. Disassemble the end cover after unscrewing bolts. Disassemble the upper and lower side cover after unscrewing bolts. Disassemble the end cover after unscrewing bolts. Disassemble bearing temps, which are installed 4 on the casing. Take out the casing after unscrewing bolts. Take out the gear shaft and gear wheel. Take out the pinion shaft and gear wheel. Take out the lower casing after unscrewing bolts. Disassemble the upper and lower coupling cover after unscrewing bolts. Disassemble the coupling hub after unscrewing bolts. Disassemble the coupling nut. Disassemble the deflector. Disassemble the thrust bearing cover after unscrewing bolts. Disassemble barrel cover nuts. Disassemble the upper thrust bearing housing after unscrewing bolts. Disassemble upper pump thrust bearings. Turn and disassemble lower pump thrust bearings. Disassemble the thrust disc after unscrewing the set screw. Disassemble the upper sleeve bearing. Turn and disassemble the lower sleeve bearing. Disassemble the lower thrust bearing housing after unscrewing bolts. Disassemble the deflector. Unscrew nuts and studs. Separate the nut after unscrewing the set screw and moving the mechanical seal forward. Disassemble the bush after disassembling the flange. Separate pins and springs after disassembling the SP retainer. Disassemble the O-ring and retainer. Disassemble the O-ring and seal ring after removing pins. Disassemble adapter and O-ring. Move the sleeve forward after unscrewing bolts. Disassemble seal ring and O-ring after removing each pins at the sleeve. Disassemble the pumping ring after disassembling the sleeve. Take out the discharge stuffing box after unscrewing nuts. Take out the discharge stuffing box after disassembling the inner bush seal. Take out the bushing and barrel cover after disassembling studs and pins. Disassemble the barrel cover after disassembling the bushing. Disassemble the deflector. Disassemble the upper radial bearing housing after unscrewing nuts, studs, and the upper and lower fasten bolts. Disassemble the upper sleeve bearing. Turn and disassemble the lower sleeve bearing. Disassemble the lower radial bearing housing after unscrewing nuts and studs. Disassemble the deflector. Disassemble the mechanical seal as the previous steps. Take out the suction cover and inner bush seal after disassembling nuts and studs. Take out the suction cover after disassembling the inner bush seal at the suction cover. Take out the shaft, balance, piston, and impeller from booster pump casing. Disassemble the impeller in order after disassembling the retainer and the balance piston. Install the wire sling after unscrewing flange bolts at the exhaust hood. Separate the exhaust hood. Separate the exhaust duct after unscrewing flange bolts at the exhaust duct and installing wire sling. Take out the MSV cover after disassembling MSV cover studs and nuts. Disassemble studs and nuts after taking out the strainer. Disassemble the coupling ring, drain cut, and lever after unscrewing bolts and nuts. Take out the blowout cover, bypass valve, valve seat, guide, and valve stem in order after disassembling the lower ring. Remove MSV York bolts. Take out the casing after installing the wire sling. Separate links after unscrewing bolts. Take out the bracket and torque shaft after unscrewing bolts. Separate hex nuts after disassembling clevis. Take out and separate studs and nuts from the base plate. Separate bolts which are fastened the CV plate and CV York. Lift up the base plate and control valve. Separate the base plate and control valve after unscrewing nuts which are clamped with the base plate. Separate the rod lift after separating bushes and hex nuts. Separate the lifting rod after disassembling hex nuts and tong washer of each bypass valve. Separate the valves from bypass valves after separating valve caps. Install the wire sling after separating clamped cold and hot bolts. Separate gland packing rings after lifting the upper casing and pushing toward the horizontal flange. Take out packing springs. Separate upper diaphragms. Take out the upper casing. Lift up the upper front stander casing after separating front stander casing bolts and installing the wire sling. Disassemble the deflector. Take out the front stander casing. Disassemble the thrust bearing casing after disassembling thrust bearing casing and front locking plates. Lift up the upper bearing after disassembling bolts and studs. Separate the adjust shim after disassembling the front thrust plates. Disassemble thrust plates after removing back locking plates. Separate the back adjust shim. Disassemble the upper bearing pad after disassembling pad dowels. Disassemble the lower thrust bearing casing after lifting the lower bearing and taking out front locking plates. Separate the adjust shim after disassembling the front thrust plates. Disassemble thrust plates and the adjust shim after taking out the back of locking plate. Disassemble the bearing pad after unscrewing pad dowel. Lift up the turning gear and deflector after unscrewing bolts and installing the wire sling. Disassemble the deflector. Take out the turning gear. Disassemble the side plate after taking out bolts. Lift up the upper bearing casing after taking out bolts. Disassemble the bearing pad after taking out the locking pins. Take out the upper bearing casing. Install the crane at the rotor. Take out the rotor after separating bolts which are clamped with the front standard. Disassemble the side plate after taking out bolts. Lift the lower bearing casing after taking out dowel pins. Disassemble the bearing pad after taking out locking pins. Take out the lower bearing casing. Hold gland packing rings and push it to the horizontal flange. Take out lower packing springs one by one. Take out lower diaphragms. Take out the lower front standard deflector. Take out the lower casing deflector.